The wind blowing across the plains of Moab, through the deep acacia groves of Shittim, carries the metallic scent of sickness and the wailing of a dying nation. It is the twilight of the 40-year wandering. The Jordan River is finally in sight, a thin ribbon of water standing between the desert and the promise. But Israel is not breaking camp to cross. They are dropping into the dust by the thousands, struck down by a terrifying contagion sweeping through the tents. See the scene. It is not the sword of an invading army cutting them down in the heat of the valley. It is the direct, unshielded wrath of their own God. 40 years of surviving venomous serpents, drought, and the armies of giants, only to be slaughtered at the absolute threshold of their inheritance. But the most jarring detail of the carnage at Shittim is not the plague itself. It is the bizarre mechanism that finally stops it. The devastation is not halted by an altar of burning incense. It is not stopped by the desperate weeping of Moses at the tabernacle door. The wrath of heaven only breaks when a priest picks up a romak, a heavy, iron-tipped javelin, walks uninvited into a closed tent and drives it straight through the bodies of a prince and a princess. One strike. One bloody act of absolute violence. How does an execution inside a private tent instantly halt a divine plague that had already consumed 24,000 men? And more fundamentally, how does the God of Israel look at a priest gripping a blood-soaked spear and reward him with an eternal covenant of peace? Sit with that. An act of war buys total reconciliation. The King James Version anchors this dark chapter in the book of Numbers. Listen to the exact phrasing of Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods. And the people did eat, and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. Stop right there. Read the progression of the verbs. They abode, they committed whoredom, they ate, they bowed, they joined. This is a descent, a highly choreographed ritual of seduction that moves from the physical to the deeply spiritual. The text points to a specific deity, Baal Peor, the Lord of the Gap, the master of the opening. The English word joined hides a much heavier Hebrew reality, a yoke of submission that bound the living to the dead. To understand why the javelin was necessary, you have to understand the depth of the corruption. The canonical text provides the raw architecture of the rebellion, but older traditions retained the terrifying, specific mechanics of the Peor cult. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah that preserves the hidden oral traditions of the synagogue, records the supernatural reality of what happened when Israel ate those sacrifices. Reading, not inventing. This was not a simple failure of morality. It was a calculated, weaponized infection. Picture it. The women of Moab are not wandering into the camp of a hostile, nomadic army by accident. This infiltration is strategic. It is a precise military operation using devotion instead of swords. There is a reason the plague erupts at this exact geographic coordinate, just miles from the crossing. A snare has been laid in the desert dust, designed by a mind that knew exactly how to dismantle the spiritual protection of Israel. The text says, "The anger of the Lord was kindled," but the fire was lit by a very specific match. The disaster at Baal Peor was not a spontaneous moral collapse, but a blueprint drawn up by a frustrated prophet who could not curse Israel from the mountain peaks. What secret counsel did Balaam whisper to the king of Moab before he vanished into the eastern desert? High on the jagged ridges of Abarim, overlooking the Jordan Valley, a diviner from the east realizes his incantations are useless. The prophet Balaam has been hired by Balak, king of Moab, to curse the black tents of Israel spread out below in the heat. 3 times he builds altars. 3 times he opens his mouth. 3 times the God of Israel overrides his tongue, forcing him to bless the people he was paid to destroy. The supernatural wall holds. Balaam knows he cannot breach the perimeter from the outside with spiritual warfare. So he designs a way for Israel to dismantle their own defenses from the inside. If heaven will not strike the camp, for a foreign king, the camp must be tricked into calling down the fire on themselves. The book of Numbers leaves Balaam's final conversation with the Moabite king off the page, but the New Testament drags the secret into the light. Listen to Christ's own words in Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak, to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. Stop right there. A stumbling block. The Greek word John uses here is scandalon, the trigger of a snare, the bait stick that snaps the cage shut. The Midianite and Moabite women were not acting on spontaneous rogue desires at the edge of the wilderness. They were deployed. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records the precise nature of this military deployment in his Antiquities of the Jews. Watch what the text does. Josephus writes that Balaam instructed the king to send the most beautiful women of the kingdom to the very edges of the Israelite camp. They were to engage the Hebrew men, drawing them out of the safety of the tribes with flattery and feigned affection. But the moment the men surrendered to the attraction, the women were ordered to abruptly pull away. They would only return on one strict condition. The Israelites must renounce the laws of Moses and bow to the local deities. I offer it as that. One tradition's record of the shadows behind the canonical text. Test it the way the Bereans tested everything. But this ancient framework perfectly matches the devastating precision of the fallout. This was a psychological siege, a weaponization of intimacy. The men of Israel, worn down by 40 years of dust, manna, and endless marching, walked right into the tripwire. The women retreated toward the altars of Baal Peor, and the men of Israel followed them into the dark, completely unaware that their treason would soon require an iron-tipped javelin to cure. They traded the God of Sinai for the intoxicating, shadowed rituals of the mountain. And the absolute moment their knees hit the dirt in worship, the supernatural protection over the camp shattered. The plague instantly began its lethal march through the tribes, dropping thousands in the sand. The sickness is spreading through the tents, but the physical death is only a symptom of a much darker, spiritual transaction. Because bowing to the statues of Moab was only the beginning of the trap. What exactly were the men of Israel eating when they sat down at the altars of the Lord of the Gap? Smoke from the high places of Moab drifts down into the valley of Shittim. The men of Israel are sitting in the dust, tearing meat from the bone. Numbers chapter 25, verse 3 records the terrible shift in their allegiance. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor. Stop right there. Look closely at that English word, joined. It feels casual. It sounds like stepping into a circle or adding your name to a registry. It softens the terror of the crime. But pull the English back to the ancient Hebrew it was translated from. The word is tazamad. It does not mean to stand near something. It means to be yoked. It is the exact word used to describe two beasts of burden, fastened together by a heavy wooden harness, locked side by side to pull a massive plow. Same yoke, same weight. By participating in the rituals on the mountain of Peor, the Israelites were not merely flirting with foreign deities. They were strapping themselves into a spiritual harness. They were binding their souls to a foreign master. But what exactly was pulling from the other side of that yoke? For centuries, casual readers assumed the sin at Baal Peor was strictly a fertility cult. a transgression of flesh and desire alone. But a hidden cross-reference in the Psalms records the dark, terrifying reality of the altar. Listen to Psalm 106, verse 28. They joined themselves also unto Baal Peor, and ate the sacrifices of the dead. Read that again. The sacrifices of the dead. This was not a simple harvest festival. This was necromancy. The Lord of the Gap was exactly that, a deity who commanded the spaces between the living and the underworld. The meat turning on the spits of Moab was offered directly to the spirits of the grave. Watch what the text does. It shifts the crime from the body to the soul. To eat a sacrifice is to commune with the entity receiving it. Men who had survived on manna, the pure bread of angels, were now falling to their knees to consume the flesh of the grave. I hold this as one reading of the ancient text, a chilling glimpse into the exact nature of the snare. But the theological physics are absolute. When you eat from an altar of the dead, you yoke yourself to death. The plague tearing through the tents of Simeon and Dan was not a random judgment. It was the direct, physical manifestation of that yoke, tzamad. The camp was suffocating because the men had tethered themselves to a corpse. Picture it. The mountain of Peor stood like a dark sentinel over the plains. The men thought they could leave the darkness up on the ridge, but the infection was not staying on the mountain. It was walking right through the front door of the camp. The wrath of heaven is burning through the tribes. Moses is weeping at the door of the sanctuary. The judges of Israel are paralyzed by the sheer scale of the death. And in the middle of this absolute chaos, one man decides to push the boundary of the curse to its breaking point. The camp is collapsing under the weight of a necromantic plague. But the deepest treason does not happen in the shadows of the mountain. It happens in the broad daylight of the sanctuary. Who would dare drag the Lord of the Gap straight to the tabernacle door? The wailing outside the tabernacle of the congregation cuts through the dry heat of the Jordan Valley. 24,000 bodies are already being dragged into the sand. Moses, the man who split the sea and spoke from the fire, is on his face in the dirt, paralyzed by a plague he cannot stop. The elders of the tribes are weeping at the sanctuary door. And right through the middle of this absolute devastation, a man is walking with a woman on his arm. See the scene. This is not a sin committed in the shadows of the high places. This is a parade. The canonical text of Numbers chapter 25, verse 6, captures the sheer audacity of the moment. And, behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Stop right there. He brought her in the sight of Moses. He brought her in the sight of the weeping congregation. The text later names them Zimri, a ruling prince of the tribe of Simeon, and Cosbi, a royal daughter of Midian. He does not sneak her into the camp under the cover of darkness. He marches her straight through the center of the paralyzed nation, past the bronze altar, past the wailing priests. Reading, not inventing. He wants the entire camp to watch him do it. The ancient Jewish writings preserved in the Jerusalem Targum record the terrifying dialogue of this exact moment. Watch what the text does. The Targum states that Zimri halted directly in front of the weeping Moses, gripping the Midianite princess, and asked a lethal, calculated question. He challenged the lawgiver in front of the dying congregation. He demanded, "Son of Amram, is this woman permitted or forbidden? And if you say she is forbidden, who permitted Jethro's daughter, a Midianite, to you?" I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but it frames the absolute treason of the act perfectly. This was not a moment of fleshly weakness. It was a theological coup. Zimri was publicly breaking the covenant, declaring that the laws of Sinai were dead, and the Lord of the Gap was the new master of the camp. His own tribe, Simeon, was suffocating under the plague, yet their ruling prince was flaunting the very cause of their destruction. The yoke of Baal Peor was no longer confined to the mountain. It had walked right up to the threshold of the holy place. Moses has no answer. He simply weeps. The plague continues its lethal march through the tents. The bronze altar offers no covering for high-handed public rebellion. The blood of a lamb cannot break the yoke of a prince who has chosen to eat with the dead. The spiritual architecture of the camp is collapsing. But somewhere in that paralyzed crowd, a man is watching. His name is Phinehas. He is the grandson of Aaron. He is a priest, a man trained to handle sacrificial blood in a bronze bowl, not iron on a battlefield. He is meant to bless, not to kill. But the tension in the camp is snapping. The romach, the heavy military javelin, is waiting in the wings. Zimri turns his back on the sanctuary, taking Cosbi by the hand, and leads her toward the dark opening of his personal tent. A line has been crossed in the dust of Shittim that tears and incense can no longer wash away. What moves a priest to abandon the weeping congregation and pick up an instrument of war? The flap of Zimri's tent falls shut. The camp of Simeon is dead silent, save for the gasping of the dying. The prince has taken the Midianite princess inside, dragging the dark spiritual yoke of the mountain directly into his own quarters. Moses is still on his face. The elders are frozen in the dust. The legal system of Israel has completely flatlined. The law cannot stop this. But out of the weeping crowd, one man breaks rank. The canonical text of Numbers chapter 25, verse 7, records the exact moment the tide turns. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. Stop right there. Watch what the text does. It explicitly names his lineage, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest. The author wants you to remember exactly what this man's hands were consecrated to do. A priest is a man of the sanctuary. His fingers are meant for the golden censer, for unleavened bread, for sprinkling the blood of a substitute on the bronze altar. A priest is explicitly forbidden from touching a corpse. It defiles him. It cuts him off from the holy place. A priest is not an executioner. But look at the verb. He rose up. The Hebrew word is kum. It does not simply mean to stand to one's feet. It implies rising to a task, taking a stand against opposition, establishing a new reality. When the leadership of Israel collapsed, Phinehas kum. He stepped completely out of his lane. He picks up a romach, a javelin. Hold that image. This is not a shepherd's staff. It is not the silver ritual knife used to slaughter a lamb at the tabernacle. The romach is a weapon of the battlefield, a heavy, iron-tipped spear designed to punch through armor. Where did a priest get a spear at the door of the tabernacle? The ancient sages who compiled the Jerusalem Targum suggest he quietly pulled it from one of the tribal guards stationed around the sanctuary, hiding the iron shaft beneath his white linen garments as he walked. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but the physical reality remains undeniable. He leaves the bronze altar behind. He is carrying war into the camp. Picture it. Phinehas walks away from the weeping congregation. He moves through the suffocating heat of the Jordan Valley, his eyes locked on the tent of Zimri. He is walking past thousands of his own people dying from the plague. Every step he takes is a deliberate violation of his priestly boundaries. If he strikes the prince, he becomes a killer. He will be covered in human blood. He makes the trade anyway. He knows the plague will not stop at the tabernacle door. The infection of Baal Peor requires a surgical amputation, and Moses is too broken to swing the blade. Phinehas reaches the edge of the tent. The heavy romach is in his hand. The dying camp holds its breath behind him. One man stands outside the fabric. The wrath of heaven rages across the valley. But the strike that is about to happen requires him to step into the dark. What exactly is waiting for the priest inside the inner chamber of the prince? The canvas flap sweeps back. The blinding glare of the Jordan Valley gives way to the shadowed, suffocating heat of the inner chamber. Phinehas steps across the threshold. The wailing of the dying camp is suddenly muffled. He is entirely alone with the prince of Simeon and the royal daughter of Midian. Numbers, chapter 25, verse 8, gives us the anatomy of the execution. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent, and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel, and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. Stop right there. Look closely at the English word tent. It sounds like an ordinary desert dwelling, the exact same temporary structure housing thousands of other Israelites. But turn the English back to the ancient Hebrew. The text does not use the standard everyday word ohel. It uses a rare, highly specific word, quba. Read that again. A quba is a domed chamber, a vaulted inner pavilion. It is an architectural term deeply tied to royal bedchambers and pagan shrines. This alters the entire landscape of the crime. Zimri and Cusby had not slipped into a common shelter to hide. They had erected a quiba, a specialized inner sanctum, directly inside the camp of Simeon. Watch what the text does. This was not a hidden moment of fleshly weakness. It was a rival sanctuary. Zimri had built a miniature temple to the Lord of the Gap, placing it in direct, brazen defiance of the tabernacle of the God of Israel. Phinehas tightens his grip on the romach. He does not issue a warning. He does not demand repentance. The judgment had already been decreed in the dust outside. He raises the heavy iron-tipped javelin in the dim light of the vault. Picture it. To drive a battlefield weapon through two human bodies requires immense, violent force. It is not a clean or quiet act. The text says he thrust them both through, but the Hebrew language hides a brilliant, terrifying phonetic echo inside this single strike. Phinehas walks into the quibah, the vaulted tent, and drives the spear through her quibah, her belly. Same sound, same target. The physical center of their union and the architectural center of their defiance are destroyed by the exact same piece of iron. The physical strike mirrored the spiritual reality. They were tsamad, yoked to the dead in life, and now permanently pinned together by the priest in death. I hold this as the stark, canonical record of the execution. The white linen of the priesthood is suddenly stained red. The metal punches through flesh, and in that absolute fraction of a second, the wrath of heaven snaps shut. Out in the valley, the divine fire instantly vanishes. The plague stops. One brutal swing of a javelin broke a supernatural curse. The text tells us they died, but it leaves the interior of the tent silent, because, according to the ancient voices of the synagogue, the physics of that strike completely defied the natural world. What exactly did the priest experience in the dark the moment the iron pierced the prince? The iron is through them. The text of Numbers is silent on the violent physics of lifting two human bodies on a single wooden shaft, but the ancient Jewish voices refuse to let the silence stand. A standard battlefield javelin cannot support the dead weight of two human adults. The wood would splinter. The bodies would slide off the iron and collapse into the dirt. And the moment the priest's hands reached down to adjust his grip or touch their corpses, he would be ceremonially defiled, unclean, cut off from the sanctuary. But there is an older Jewish writing, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic translation of the Torah read in the ancient synagogues, and it records the supernatural reality of what happened inside the quibah. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. But the Targum records a series of sudden, impossible miracles that erupted in the dark of the tent the second the Romak struck. Watch what the text does. It claims the wood of the javelin miraculously hardened to bear the immense weight of the prince and the princess. The heavy lintel of the tent was lifted by an unseen angel so Phinehas could carry the bodies out horizontally, high in the air. And most importantly, the blood. The text says the defiling blood of the dead was supernaturally frozen. It coagulated perfectly around the iron wound, ensuring that not a single drop fell onto the priest's white linen garments. Reading, not inventing. He was executing judgment, but heaven was actively protecting his priesthood. He was not a rogue murderer acting in the shadows. He was a priest offering a violent, necessary sacrifice to sever the yoke of Baal Peor. Picture it. Phinehas steps backward out of the dim quibar. He is carrying the physical evidence of the broken curse on the end of his spear. He walks back into the blinding, suffocating heat of Shittim. Zimri had paraded the Midianite princess into the camp to show the nation that the law of Sinai was dead. Phinehas now parades them out on a spear to show the nation that the God of Sinai is still breathing. Same path, opposite message. He reaches the edge of the sanctuary. The thousands dying in the dust look up. Moses, still kneeling at the door of the tabernacle, looks up. The brazen display of treason has been met with a brazen display of judgment. He slams the javelin into the earth. Numbers chapter 25, verse 8 ends with a sudden, jarring finality. So, the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. Stop right there. The English word stayed feels almost passive, like a desert storm slowly running out of wind. But the Hebrew word is atzah, to violently restrain, to physically arrest, to slam a heavy door shut. The absolute fraction of a second, the bodies hit the dirt. The invisible necromantic fire of the mountain was extinguished. The plague stopped mid-breath. The yoke was broken. 24,000 Israelites lay dead in the sand. The wailing was still echoing against the canyon walls of Moab, but the dying was over. Phinehas stands over the bodies, his hands gripping the wooden shaft, waiting for the fire of heaven to fall on him. He stepped out of his lane. He took a life. 2 bodies in the dust, 1 weapon in the ground. But heaven is not silent. When the Creator finally speaks from the holy place, what does he hand the priest who just became an executioner? Go back now to the plains of Moab, to the deep acacia groves of Shittim, where this film began. You have read this chapter 100 times, seeing only a sudden plague and a violent spear. But tonight, the scene is different. You know exactly what the camp was suffocating under. You know the dark, calculated counsel of Balaam, the snare of the scandalon, and the terrible weight of the tsamad, the yoke that bound the living to the dead. Look at the priest standing over the bodies in the dust. He waits for the fire of heaven to strike him for touching a corpse, for shedding blood in the shadow of the sanctuary. But the fire does not fall on Phinehas. Listen to the voice of the Creator breaking the silence in Numbers chapter 25, verses 12 and 13. Wherefore say, Behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, even the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God, and made an atonement for the children of Israel. Stop right there. Read that again. A covenant of peace. It is the ultimate paradox of the wilderness. But look closely at the final phrase. He made an atonement. The Hebrew word is kafar, to cover, to reconcile. For 40 years, the nation had been taught that atonement required a bronze altar, the smoke of incense, and the blood of a spotless lamb. Sit with that. In the valley of Shittim, atonement was not made with a sacrificial lamb. It was made with an iron javelin. Phinehas did not break his priestly vows when he picked up the Romak. He fulfilled their deepest, most terrifying mandate. A priest's job is to stand between the living and the dead, to protect the holy space from corruption. When the leadership froze, Phinehas realized that the infection of Baal Peor could not be washed away with water or covered by tears. The yoke had to be violently severed. The javelin was not a weapon of murder. It was an instrument of absolute, surgical mercy. I hold this as one reading, not the final word, a bridge between the ancient awe of the sages and the stark ink of our Bible. But the divine response is undeniable. The God of Israel looks at the blood on the spear and declares it righteous. He grants Phinehas an everlasting priesthood, a promise that outlasts the wilderness and echoes into eternity. The plague is over. The 24,000 are buried in the sand, but the desert is still holding the rest. Because the doctrine of Balaam did not entirely die in the dust that day. The blueprint of the snare, the slow, intoxicating drift toward the sacrifices of the dead remains a shadow at the edges of the text. The Lord of the Gap is always waiting for the camp to lower its guard. Comment, the word watched, and subscribe to keep uncovering the buried, ancient architecture of the text, and send this to one person who loves the deep wilderness of Scripture but has never heard what actually happened inside the tent at Baal Peor. The spear is heavy, but sometimes the camp only survives because a priest is willing to carry it.